hear me okay? All right, good enough. I try to ask in the evenings. I don't use them unless I need to. Y'all know I'm plenty loud. But sometimes we got some folks that need the. Okay.
Ellen says you need it.
I was looking for headsets. I didn't see any. All right, let's try that. Gotta get all my gadgets turned back on here. This morning, I guess some of you got tickled a little bit. When I got almost done, I said that was the introduction. But it was. That was the introduction. I didn't realize it was going to take that much time to go through the information that I had. But nonetheless, I'm not going to complain. I haven't heard any complaints. If you got one, keep it to yourself and we'll all be happy. Some that I wanted to point out from our reading in Revelation chapter 6 really quickly before, well, as we get into this, I mean, it still applies and plays a role in what we're looking at. This morning, I began part of our discussion with looking at Revelation 6 because I knew we had some visitors in our midst. We had some here who I have a feeling, or at least have probably heard some of the false teachings that come out of the book of Revelation. And with our scripture reading this morning, dealing with those four horsemen that were coming out that so many like to affiliate with nothing but the apocalypse, I felt it necessary to at least point out a little bit of the figurative language that was used and what that was pointing to. But as we were going through our reading tonight, one of the verses in here kind of hit me a little bit, and where it didn't when we went through chapter 6 in our Bible class study. And it was coming down through the end. When you look at verse 12, it says, I looked and the sixth seal was open. He saw him open the sixth seal. And the very last verse is, for the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Here's what I want us to look at with this. When it comes to the book of Revelation, we understand, at least those of us in here understand, that these things were dealing with goings on within the first few centuries of the existence of the church. And here, I believe, in verse 17, is one of those verses which depicts the time period in which these things were occurring. Notice I said were in the past, because they already had. Okay? If you notice verse 17, he says, for the great day of his wrath has come.
Yes, sir.
What does that mean? Here, now. So we understand that there had to be an immediate context of which that applied. You notice in Revelation chapter 1, John said those things which were soon to come to pass. And when were they going to come to pass? The day of the wrath was there. They were going to be given a little time of warning to prepare, but not very much. And we see the fall of that Roman Empire because the king of all, the king of everything, the king of nature, the king of eternity, had already decreed it. That's what we were looking at this morning with the reign of Christ. You know, when we consider the devastation that happens upon this world, I guess it's different when you see things happen, the things that nature does to this world, when it's places that you're familiar with. For some reason, it means more to you. That was my hometown. That's where I grew up. And when I see those things, these were places that I passed every day. Some of these places were homes that I had been in and out of. And now you think from just a few minutes of a storm. I watched some of the storm chaser videos of that tornado while it was on the ground. You know how long it was on the ground? About 5 minutes. But you could watch this thing. It started like this, and as it was on the ground, it grew more and more and more intense, and this thing was just enormous. That was just one of them. But nonetheless, you look at how much destruction is there, and people have said that if you look at the destructive power within the most massive tornado you can imagine, you might see the fingernail of God. Might. Because you really must consider that. We notice this insignia that one particular nation would run. Now, every nation seems to have an insignia, don't they? We've got an insignia, other nations have insignias, and they are supposed to stand for what that nation represents. Yet this one stood for the representation that this king was deemed this insignia necessary. His idea was that every nation in the world was going to bow to a nation as small as Austria. Little bitty place in this world. But that was the mindset he had. Now we noticed in our study this morning that the insignia that Christ has upon his kingdom is the insignia of righteousness. You remember? Righteousness shall be his scepter, shall be the scepter of his kingdom. It shall be righteousness. So we notice that there is an insignia even within the kingdom of God. And what is that? It is a symbol, it is a sign which everyone around you would see. Have you ever had anyone tell you, you know, there's something different about you? You ever had anybody tell you that? You've been around individuals. I remember early in my career as a paramedic, I had a young man working with me, and it was one of his first shifts with his company, at least out where I was at. We were out in that Harrison County area, out in Cedar Creek Lake, Maybank, Gun Barrel, all that. And he come out for his first shift out there, and we had been working about 14 hours out of this 24 so far. And we were sitting there, we had a moment to ourselves. He was sitting there, he said, "Are you a member of the Church of Christ?" I thought, "Yeah." "Why?" He said, "Because you don't talk like everybody else." I thought, wow, how insignificant. Something that insignificant. You know what that is? That's a symbol of who you are. Mm-hmm. That is a symbol of righteousness. That is an insignia of what represents the kingdom out in the world. Something as insignificant as you don't talk like everybody else. I was like, "What do you mean?" He said, "Everybody else cusses stem to stern." He said, "I've seen you get angry on this hill, and it didn't happen." Something similar to that. He said, "You don't talk like everybody else." Folks, that's not to brag on me. That's just a simple fact of when you try to live righteously. How many of you get uncomfortable when somebody starts using profanities? Do you? You get uncomfortable? If you get uncomfortable, you know what that is not a representation of? That individual's righteousness toward you. You want to know what righteousness is? We hear righteous, we hear godliness all the time, right? And we try to give examples of what righteousness is. This is an example of righteousness. Right acting toward other individuals. And when someone does not have the wherewithal to keep their language clean around you, knowing and seeing the discomfort upon you when they begin spitting those profanities out, that is unrighteous. What does that mean? Because they're doing something that makes you uncomfortable, that you see is wrong, and they know it. That's unrighteousness. That is not right acting toward fellow men. Therefore, you see righteousness as that symbol of the kingdom. Now, I'm going to try to keep my introduction short tonight. What? I heard somebody say, "Yeah, right." Anyway, I'm glad we can pick at one another around here. I'm glad we can enjoy one another, be around one another that way, and just have fun and enjoy life. This morning we took a look at, and going through Psalm 93, at the first verse of Psalm 93, and notice the Lord reigns, he is clothed with majesty, the Lord is clothed. He has girded himself with strength, surely the world is established so that it cannot be moved. And we noticed how this is a representation of the king as he is reigning and his adornment. One thing that I did not point out this morning, and I want to throw it in now because we're going to come back to it in a little while, is notice that in this adorning, it says that he has girded himself. Mm-hmm. Who did it? He did. Guess what I didn't do? Guess who it's not up to? Not up to me. It's not up to you. It's not up to any human in this world to adorn or gird the king. He did it himself. And what did he do it with? Strength. He girded himself with strength. He clothed himself with majesty. He did this. Now, that's going to play an important role when we get down to verse 5. Okay? We'll put those two together when we get there. So keep that in mind. The king being crowned is the king adorned. Is a king before he gets the crown? Hang on, think about this. Is a king before he receives the crown? No, because he becomes the king at his coronation. He receives the crown at his coronation. He is coronated king, thereby receiving the crown, the symbol of the authority of that individual. So we know that the king is now king in the psalmist's eye because he now has been adorned, he's been crowned. But what else has the king been? Notice verses 2 through 4. Your throne is established from old. You are from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O Lord, the floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their waves. The Lord on high is mightier than the noise of many waters, than the mighty waves of the sea. Within verses 2 through 4, we see that the king is confident. We see that he has a place of prominence. Now, I use those chess pieces as a representation of the king's position for a reason. How many of you ever played chess? I'm just curious. It's not a very fun game for some. For others, it's a blast because they know how to maneuver, they know how to set up, they know how to plan, they know how to read what they think you're about to do. And next thing you know, they cut your throat and you didn't even see it coming. What's the point to this game? The point to this game is to maneuver yourself into a prominent position, into a position of power, into a position of which the opponent cannot overcome. You get that king moved into you get that queen and your rook and your knight and your bishop adjusted so that you can put that king into check. And when you put that king into check, you try your hardest to get it to where ain't nowhere else he can go. Checkmate, it's over with. That's the end of the game. Brethren, the king has placed himself in a position of prominence. And now, as far as the prince of this world is concerned, checkmate, it's over with. All we got to do is continue until the end. We've got to outlast what time is left on this earth. The checkmate is there. I've got to figure out where I want to align myself. Now, the king in verses 2 through 4, we see his confidence. It is a position of confidence. Confidence is a belief in oneself and in one's powers or abilities. Do you think the Lord doubts himself? Absolutely not. Look at where he is himself. Your throne is established. When? From old. How long? From everlasting. How long is it going to last? Eternally. So we see there that he is in a confident position. It is a position from the beginning. Notice he said, your throne is established from old. Before the beginning was, your throne was already there. People say, what do you mean? How can there be a before the beginning? Because in the beginning, God created. For in the beginning to be, God was already here. That's everlasting. Notice he says your throne is from everlasting. Two descriptions of what it is. He gives us the short timeline, then he gives us the long time. The long time is it didn't start. It was already there. Your throne was from before the beginning, and it is from everlasting. So we see that the confident position of this throne is one of eternal. It's always been there. There's never been anything any time at which it wasn't. But I want us to notice also that within this verse, there is a confident prominence. Notice verse 3. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods have lifted up their waves. Have you ever been down to the ocean? You know, when you get down to the ocean, there is a lot of noise coming off of that water, isn't it? As those waves come roaring in, and you let a storm come in and let those waves grow and let them become higher and higher and higher, and notice how much more intensely the noise coming off the waves is. Now us as humans, we look at that and we see one of the most destructive powers upon this world. Natural disasters. Think of natural disaster. We've seen some pretty massive earthquakes happen. They've taken a lot of lives, haven't they? But what about waves? Think about the tsunamis. Yeah. Think about the massive tidal waves. When they come in, think about Katrina. Something just as close to home, y'all. Think about Katrina. And notice think about how many lives were lost in an instant. Earthquakes are destructive, but brethren, from my mind's eye, my point of view, it would seem that the most destructive power upon this earth is that is sitting in our oceans. Because all you have to, here's the thing, you have that earthquake, guess what it does? It causes a huge wave to take off and hit land somewhere else. Matter of fact, one of the latest tsunami was at the Philippines at the last tsunami we had hit. Wasn't that the cause of it? Because of an earthquake on land on another continent caused an enormous wave to erupt and build and build and build as it went. Until it went how many hundreds of miles inland? And taking out millions of lives in the process. You see, we see things such as a wave and the ocean's power, and we see something intense. We see something terrifying. And when you look at the relationship of that to physical kings, we see the same thing. How many people do not... I want to be careful how I say this, how far I go with it. How many of the citizens of North Korea do you think are not scared out of their wits from that lunatic that's ruling them right now? He's a lunatic, y'all. I'm just going to put it out there. It's on the internet. Look it up, Kim. You can find it. He's nuts. How many people that live within that country do you not think are terrified of him? Why do you think it is they're all skinny and he's fat? Look, I'm fat. I can talk about fat guys. The point is, we as people will look at a ruler, a physical ruler in his place of prominence, and we see power, we see strength, we see ability, and just like the waves of this world, it terrifies us. It terrifies us. You can say, well, I'm not terrified of our ruler, folks. We live in a different kind of society than most of the world. We do. But you look at most of the world, and the rulers of those individual nations, the people are scared to death of them. They're tyrants. Now, here's the comparison. Notice verse 4. The Lord on high is mightier. He's mightier. Remember, I told you we were going to look at an expository type study of Psalm 93, and that's what we're doing. I've got a number of passages for us to reference. And I encourage you to write those down and study those cross references, see what it is we're talking about. But when we're looking at an expository study, we want to see what that text says. Okay? So what do you have here? He says, the Lord on high is mightier. He is stronger than anything that we see on this world that we think is the strongest thing here. Here's what I want us to notice. In this comparative relationship, the psalmist compares kings of this world as the waves of the ocean. Now notice what he says. The noise of, he says he is higher and he is mightier than the noise of many waters, than the mighty waves of the sea. Here's the thing. Those powers have no power to move against him. Their boasting is just that. It's just noise. Think about that. That's how he's declaring this. Those waves that you're worried about, in the presence of the king, they're just noise. They're scaring you to death, and he looks at it like, that ain't nothing. That's nothing to be worried about. That's nothing to be concerned with. He says it is the noise of many waters and the mighty waves of the sea. They cannot reach his height. They cannot find his glory. They have no way to touch his majesty. They can't do it. The noisy waves, in comparison to him, they are no more than just simply a mere nuisance. That's it. And one that he has the ability to brush off. Do you remember when he was asleep in the boat? Down in the bottom of the boat with his disciples, and all this storm came up, and the waves were raging around this boat, and it was tossing the boat, and the boat was filling with water, and his disciple says, Lord, why are you asleep? You remember what he did? He stood up, and he rebuked the wind. Folks, a brush of his hand. And that's all it takes. And those mighty waves all of a sudden become calm waters. Those things that terrify us, our king's not worried about.
Amen.
Those kings that terrify us, those tyrants who rule men, the reign of Christ is not a reign of terror. It is a reign of confidence. It is a reign of promise. Notice his rule. He has a confident rule. The laws of this world are at his every command. The beings in heaven, brethren, are at his even at his beck and call. If you notice, the psalmist declared in 148 verses 2 through 5 that he was the one who created the angels of this world and everything that is in it. Job was told, even in Job chapter 38, verses 4 through 7. You remember when Job finally got to the point where he finally started complaining enough, and the Lord showed up and said, Job, it's time for you to understand what's happening here. He says, Job, in there in verse 1 and 2, he says, where were you when I laid the foundations of this earth? Where were you when the morning stars jumped for joy and leaped for joy? Where were you, Job? Where were you when the angels of heaven were rejoicing over the creation of this earth? Where were you, Job? What's the point? God's saying, I did that. In other words, he created that. He has control of that the same way he has control of this. Everything is within his hands, and it was this realization that Nebuchadnezzar came to when he was out there eating grass like a cow. Can you imagine that? I know I've used this illustration several times, but it's so fitting. Especially when we're sitting here talking about rulers of nations. Here is Nebuchadnezzar, one of the most tyrannical rulers in history. One of the most bloodthirsty kings to ever rule. Do you realize the crucifixion goes back to Nebuchadnezzar's days, at least as far as the process of it? The Romans didn't invent that. They just perfected it. The idea of crucifixion came from the days of Assyria, even before Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar would envelop this stuff as well. And here is this mighty king, this ruler of nations, this one that said, I did all this. Can you imagine what the soldier who was out there having to guard him thought? This is my king. He's over here eating grass, snorting and pawing at the ground. He's over here eating grass. He can't even talk anymore. He's crazy. He's lost his mind. Can you imagine the neighboring nations having people come in and investigate to see what's going on? Somebody says, hey, I want to see the king. Oh, he's out there mowing the weeds. How with his teeth? Brethren, the realization that Nebuchadnezzar came to was he said, I know that the God of heaven ruleth in the kingdom of men. That's the same realization that we can come to. What do we do with this information? Brother, we take this information and we see that when a tyrannical leader comes up on us and they begin pressing us down, they can only take you so far. They can only take you to the point of death. You understand that? Mm-hmm. They can only take you to the point of death. But rather fear him who is able to cast both body and soul into hell. That's the one that I'm concerned with. So no matter what some earthly leader may do to me, the Lord says that's nothing but mere noise. It's just a nuisance to me that I can brush away as I would a fly from my ear. Think about that. Finally, as we begin bringing this together, I want us to notice verse 5. It says, your testimonies are very true. Holiness adorns your house, O Lord, forever. You notice back up in verse 1, he says, surely the world is established so that it cannot be moved. He's talking about the commandments which he made, the testimony which he uttered. He said, look, what we're seeing is that the king is constant. If you notice in the first part of the psalm, the second part of the psalm, your testimonies are very true. He goes on forever. Yeah, I used a number to get your attention, a number that goes on forever. A number that doesn't quit. There's always another number that comes at the end of it. It's constant. It goes on and on and on, brother. That's our king. Every earthly king, you know what happens to him? He dies. And his reign comes to an end. Those poor folks in North Korea, one of these days, they're going to be relieved of that fellow. His reign is going to come to an end. What's going to step in his place? I don't have the slightest idea. But I can tell you this much, his reign of terror will come to an end. You know whose reign will not end? The reign of Christ. Because his reign is constant. The idea of a command, this is a testimony, this is a commandment. It is an instruction. What did the commands do? They instructed Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. How often were they supposed to teach them? All the time. When you get up in the morning, when you're out working in the day, when you come in at night, when you go down and lay down to go to sleep at night. You always teach them of these things. The commandments expose sin, Romans 7 verse 7. Paul said, I wouldn't have known sin had it not been for the law. He said, I would not have known lust except the law said, thou shalt not covet. In other words, the law brought these things forth. The law would serve as a witness against those. Deuteronomy chapter 31, 26 and 28. That was the purpose of one of the purposes of the law. It was to witness, to say, I told you what to do. Now, the choice is yours. You either do it or you don't. Remember what Joshua told the people? Joshua 24:15. He says, choose, choose, choose. Right now, choose who you're going to serve. Whether it's going to be the gods of the Amorites, of those gods back across the river. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Choose. You make the choice. The decision is up to you. One of the things that made me curious as I was studying is we always hear this word holy, don't we? Have you ever wondered what that means? What does it mean to be holy? Now, in our mind, our minds and our hearts, we will put a connotation upon this word because most of us, those of us who have been a part of the Lord's body for so many years, have been taught and we have an idea of what holiness is. But have you ever tried to define it? If you define this, folks, you wind up coming up with a bunch of words to define it. Why? Here's what I mean. What is holiness? The quality or the state of being holy? Sanctity? Well, now I didn't know what holy is. What is holy? Specially recognized as or declared sacred by religious authority. It's consecrated. Wait a minute, sacred? You see, I'm coming up with all these different words to describe it. What is sacred? Sacred means devoted or dedicated to a deity. If it's had to be hallowed. Wait a minute, consecrated. That other definition said consecrated. What does that mean? To make or declare sacred. I notice in all these things, sacred, sanctity, sanctify, consecrated. Sanctity means holiness, saintliness, or godliness. Hallowed means to be regarded as hallowed, as holy, venerated, sacred. So I got to looking at these different definitions. And I became curious about how could I take these definitions of holiness and lump them into one understandable definition. Rather, I hope this is correct, because this is what I came up with. Holiness, it is the quality or the state of being set apart to the service of deity. That's holiness. It is the quality that adorns the house of the king. Notice there, he says, holiness adorns your house, O Lord, forever. Here's what I see. His house is set apart. His house is sacred. His house is to serve him, and I am a part of his house. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. I learned that within this, that we are lively stones used to build the house. Therefore, for me to be a part of that house, righteousness and holiness must be my symbol. Therefore, I am consecrated to the state of being set apart to his service. Now, let's take a look back at verse 1 and put that idea of adornment together. He has girded himself with strength. He has clothed himself with majesty. Holiness adorns his house. Remember I asked you earlier, who did the clothing? Who did the adorning? He did. Who decorated your house? Who decorated your home? You did. Christ will decorate his own house. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15, or verse 13, verse 15. Paul told Timothy, I'm telling you these things so that you'll know how to behave yourself in the house of God. What's the house of God? The church. Who makes up the house of God? You do. Who is the adornment of the house of God? You are. Therefore, righteousness, godliness, saintliness, holiness needs to be the character which is presented in my life to all the world around me. You see, the choice is mine as to whether or not I am going to allow myself to be the adornment in the house of God. It is a constant beautification. One of the commentators that I use quite often has a lot of study into the Old Testament, the Hebrew. In concerning this verse, he says proper sentence structure should read something like, the manner of a prayer is the holiness of your dwelling place is inviolable. In other words, cannot be violated. This is written in the manner of a prayer and is a petition that God, for the rest of time, be pleased to secure the place of his honor among men, to remain free from the profane. What can I walk away from that with? What knowledge do I gain from that? If I'm going to live the life of the profane, I will not be adorning the house of God. He won't allow it. He will not allow it. So no matter what I think may be okay, no matter what I think should be allowed, the fact of the matter is, what does God say? That's what it comes down to. The king has the right to dictate what will and what will not be used in his kingdom. What will and what will not be allowed into his place of reign. The king is adorned with everlasting, unquestionable rule. The king has an insurmountable power. He has unmatched abilities in the highest power. He has the greatest force, of which there is no reckoning from below. Our King, Christ, our King is holy. Our King is sovereign. Our King is pure. May we walk away from here today knowing that our King reigns, and that our King is a King which we can trust forever. He is crowned. He is constant. He is continual. He will always be there. We don't have to worry about whether or not the reign of our King will come to an end. The only thing we got to worry about is whether or not our subjection will come to an end. You see, there's some things that a king has to have. A king has to have a place in which he rules, a kingdom. A king has to have a throne on which he sits to rule. And a king has to have a people over which he rules. We being set up as lively stones within that same chapter of 1 Peter chapter 2, it says you are a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Therefore, that's the way we are to act. If there is anyone here tonight who is in need of the prayers of this congregation, for whatever your need may be, if you need to put on your Lord in baptism, we can take care of that right now. If you need the prayers of this congregation, because maybe it is that your life hasn't been the example of that royal priesthood, that holy nation, that righteousness, that holiness, that godliness, then start right now. Do things differently. Remember what Joshua said. Choose. Choose. Right now. Choose. If there's anyone here tonight